Good morning, friends. We know that God is good, that He is love, that He is just, that He is merciful, and all these things. We can easily spend months in Bible study discussing the attributes of God, who God is, and what He's like. And it's important to do that because, as we've seen lately, we can only know what good is when the thing we're looking at lines up with the nature of God. The same thing with love. An action isn't loving, no matter what man may say, if the action goes against what God would do or what God would have us to do. And one I haven't mentioned, but is obviously related because there's an awful lot of talk in the world today about justice, is justice. An action can only be considered just, no matter what men and women might say otherwise. It's not just if it's not just according to God. And that might be a starting point for what I want to talk about today, because we often think about God in terms of God is good and God is love again. And while it's certainly not a foreign concept to us, I want to spend just a moment thinking about what it means that God is just. And to use this as an example for kind of all of His qualities. Because just in terms of God's justice, in Deuteronomy 32:4, we read, "The rock, His work is perfect, for all His ways are just, a God of faithfulness, and without injustice, righteous and upright is He." So clearly God is just. That doesn't come as a surprise, but what does that mean in terms of being a quality of God? Well, it means that God acts with justice, right? It means that God acts according to justice. But when we think about these things, and we say them in this way, to say that God acts with justice or according to justice, are we saying that justice is a quality that exists outside of God? Apart from God, and God just happens to have, as part of His identity, the attribute that already exists called justice? Now, I know this may seem a little bizarre, or like we're trying to look too deep into things, kind of past the point of any practical usefulness, but I ask you to just stick with me a little bit here, because we need to go into the realm of the abstract. We need to think deep thoughts. As my brother used to tell his congregation, we need to put our thinking caps on. When we think of God and His attributes, okay, whether justice or love or grace or kindness, are these things, these attributes, do they exist independent of God? I guess another way to ask this would be, if God did not exist, would there be such things as justice or love or grace or kindness? And I'm convinced our answer must be a resounding no. If God did not exist, these qualities, these concepts would not exist, because they don't exist outside of God. God is the source of these things. God is just, not because justice exists as a concept separate from God, but it's a concept that God is in and of Himself. The only reason justice exists is because God exists, and God is just. The only reason any form of goodness exists is because God is good, and so on. In so many ways, these are incredibly simple thoughts, to the point where it's like, well, yeah, of course God is good and God is just. But they're also incredibly profound and deep things to consider, because God is God. He is completely other. He's in a complete other category from us. A man or a woman can act in justice or be marked by kindness, but if that man or woman were to cease to exist, that doesn't mean justice or kindness would cease to exist, because that man or woman isn't the source of those things. But God is the source of all good things. And if He were to cease to exist, so too would justice and kindness and love and all the rest that God is, because these things exist essentially within God Himself. And this is why nothing can truly be called good if it contradicts God, because God is good. He is Himself the standard of goodness. Again, not that He has a quality of goodness, but no, He is good. And nothing is just if it contradicts God's justice. God himself is the standard of justice, and so on. That's why we must go back to God at every point when we ask questions like these. If thus and such an action, or thus and such a philosophy is good or just or kind or loving or even merciful, we cannot set those standards up by thoughts that we have in our own heads, our own standards. We must go back to God on these things, his nature, the essence of who he is. And it's helpful to understand in this matter then that God does not change. So therefore the definitions, the standards of goodness, justice, mercy, and so on, they don't change either. Now, that doesn't mean these things won't look different in different situations. The good act or the just act or even the loving act might look different in situation A from situation B, different context. But the essence of these things, the fundamental principles of these things don't change because they come from who God is, and he does not change. And I hope that this is an encouraging truth for you, especially because we live in a world that is ever changing. We live in a basically worldwide culture and society that will morph itself, that will bend over back on itself, that will alter itself, willing to change definitions, change standards, change norms at will in order to suit people's desires and demands so as not to be stopped from doing whatever it is they want to do. And that creates an incredibly chaotic world where those actual basic principles of evolution, which is all about change, dictates everything, which means the strongest, the most aggressive, the most calculating, in many senses the most efficiently cruel, well, those are the folks who rise to the top of the heap. Because force of power is all that matters in a system where you can change the rules and the standards at will to suit your purposes as long as you have the power to force that change. But know this, God does not change, and ultimate power lies with him and within him, and he is good and just and everything else that he is, and he will put both his goodness and justice along with all that he is in his holiness and majesty and righteousness on display soon enough. And that is an encouraging thought for those who belong to him. So have a good and godly day, my friends, and Lord willing, I will see you soon.